Our first storyteller is Robert Charron, and he is an architect. He spends most of the year in Syracuse, but 90% of his work is done up here. But it turns out he's not going to tell us anything about architecture. He is going to tell us a work story from childhood. So if everyone could give him a round of applause.
Oh, this is not bad. Can you hear me okay? Want a little bit? Okay. Okay. Oh, well, thank you for inviting me to this. And I have to say, as a trustee of the museum, I've been here many, many times. And every time I come in, I see something I didn't notice before. Like this mural right here. Here's this gentleman with a necktie pulling up to Hutchinson's Boat Works. And I always thought he had his hand on the wheel of the boat. I wonder if he has his hand on his wallet. Could be. Okay, I was going to tell a story about how I built my first boat at age 9, but it sank within 20 seconds, so there's not much of more to that. But around 1959 or 60, I was growing up in Ogdensburg. As a Boy Scout, I worked at Camp Vigor of the Woods in St. Lawrence County. It's located in Parrishville, New York, on a place called Clear Pond, which it's not. Clear. So, there was a large mess hall there, but every Wednesday it would close down to give the cooks and the people working there a night off. And so we were given provisions to either cook in our campsite or go on a hike. And somebody came up with the bright idea of going to a place called Rainbow Falls. And it was a trek, 7 or 8, 9 miles through the woods. And in those days, the scout camp was, we had those war surplus, heavy canvas sleeping bags and tents. And so they put all of our provisions and tents in a pickup truck, which had to drive about 50 miles, meandering around the North Country to finally drop off our food and our equipment there. So we're hiking along, and we came to a fork in the trail, and our fearless leader said, "Look this way, look that way," and I think it's this way, I'm sure. So we hiked along for almost an hour, and he stopped and looked around and looked around. And, no, this doesn't seem right. So we had to turn around, and we headed back. So we arrived at our campsite, and we were quite late. And so the truck that dropped off all of our stuff kind of got tired of waiting around, so they just left everything there. And we found everything intact except the raccoons had gotten into our dinner and ate everything. It was around that time that some enterprising young Boy Scout noticed all these frogs hopping around. And that's what we had for dinner. Frog legs. What they would do is they'd bonk them on the head with a rock. The frogs were not happy. And it was a squeamish, eater as a kid, but I decided I had to try one. And somebody said, "Tastes like chicken, doesn't it?" So the rest of the camping experience was really wonderful. They didn't get into the eggs, so we had a nice breakfast and hiked back the next day. So, okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. Just thinking a little bit about children at work, I did forget to mention that, so the photographic part of the project continued, and at ncpr.org/work, there are over 3,000 images of work from around the region. And we actually do have a tag for when we see a child in a photograph, because you go back 50, 60, 70 years, and we hear this all the time in the stories. There are kids out there doing the haying, there are kids in the tanning, in the mills and that sort of thing. So, and we also have a bunch of photos from Alex Bay up on the website as well, if you want to check those out. So our next story is not about child labor, but it is a little bit about ministry and a little bit about one of the islands up here. So give a big round of applause for Bob Vrooman.
Uh, Growing up here, they didn't have to explain to you what hard work was about. Am I okay? All right, there you go. Because my parents just showed us, like a lot of people when they came here, they had to work 2 jobs. In the 50s, they were building the dams, and Pop would go up there and build forms with people like Manny Slate, who talked here earlier. So you just learn by watching people what hard work was about. And it was interesting that years later, I had served 7 years in my home church here up on the hill in Alex Bay. And when I finished that, Brad in the back row was kind enough to hire me to work on Bolt Castle over here. And lo and behold, there was Manny at Bolt Castle. But what Manny would do is he'd go around and tell me, shh, Pastor Bob's over here, watch your language. We started working in the fall over there, and we were rebuilding the gazebo, and then Brad taught us how to point up the stones and stuff. And then underneath a cover, if you know where the dining room is there's an open area, but it's covered. And we poured cement on there into a drain, and then put sand on it, and then we had to put pavers on it like they had put all around the walkways. It was interesting because we were working later and later that year than usual. The ladies stayed there, and they were keeping the fire going in the fireplace and stuff. We could eat lunch in there. But it got into November, and it got really late. And so they had let us stay in the parsonage while we were looking for a house. And Jerry had loaned me his little 12-foot aluminum boat with a 5-horsepower motor, which was really great because the parsonage is right over here. And so all I had to do was shoot across a couple hundred yards to the castle. Otherwise, I'd have to drive like 4 miles out to the bridge, and then 1.5 miles over the bridge, and 4 miles back to the boathouse over there. So this was really great, except that as it got colder and colder, I'm multi-layers of stuff, and I got my hoodies on, and I got my Carhartt bibs on, and my Carhartt coat. And one day it was really windy, and the swells were out there, and it's cold, and I'm sitting on top of a cushion on my seat, bouncing all over the place, and all of a sudden it hits me. If I bounce out of this boat, nobody's ever going to find me. Because, I got so much stuff on, I'm not going to be able to swim, and it's like 150 feet deep, and the water is colder than anything. So immediately, I just sat right down at the bottom of the boat, get my center of gravity down so that I wouldn't be washed out of the boat. But after that, I was a little more careful going back and forth. So I wanted to go back and tell you a little bit more about what we were doing. We were laying these pavers down, right? And so we got all the cement done and got the sand down, and they bring up pallet after pallet after pallet of these pavers. And we take a hand cart up and grab a few of them on there and get them up and put them down, tamp them down. And Brad showed me how to use the diamond saw. So I was the cutter if you had to go around a fireplace or something like that. But I'm looking at these pallets and I'm saying, we're going to die here. We're never going to get this done. There's just your little cart and just pallet after pallet. But what I learned in that process is, you just got to keep after things a little bit at a time. Slow and easy wins the race and that kind of stuff. And what was really great about it is that I don't get back to the castle very often. But now when I go back, I feel like in some small way, I had a chance to put something in there and say that I had part of that. If you don't mind, I'm going to switch over to a different type of work. I was blessed to not only have the church in the Bay, but then to get the Theresa Presbyterian Church for 20 years and run Pinehurst at the same time. And we had a lot of fun. This is a service area, service economy, really. People come in and you meet their needs and stuff. And in many ways, I think the church is the same thing. When we were in the Bay, I always felt anyway, if you couldn't laugh in church, it really wasn't worth being there too much. And I remember when they started doing the recycling, if you weren't careful, you put it out in a clear bag, they wouldn't take it. They put a sticker on it, rejected. And so the kids had this great idea. We would do a skit in a certain day in church, and they had their bag out there. And if you know Clark Dingman, he's 6'11", and they had him be the recycling police and come along and arrest the kids for having bad recycling. A little more somber, but very meaningful story. I had one couple in my second church over in Theresa that were married 73 years, and I really hoped, that they'd make it to 75, Gerald and Margaret. And Gerald was sick, and he needed an operation, so I said, look, I'll take you to Syracuse for the operation. And as it would happen, one of our people, well, actually a couple, was in the Oswego nursing home. And of course, Gerald and Margaret had known them for years. And Buck died. And Buck died the week that I was supposed to take them to the surgery. And it's back that the day that I was supposed to take them to the surgery, I said, listen, Margaret and Gerald, if you don't care, you can be our church representatives. And on the way to your surgery, we're going to go to a funeral. And they, they knew these people. They were important parts of the church for a long time. So they said, sure, why not? So in a blinding snowstorm, I got these, 93-year-old people out in the car. And as the reverse of usual, you go to Syracuse and it gets worse. It got better by the time we got to Watertown, thank heaven. So we made it to the funeral, and we did that. And then I dropped Gerald and Margaret off at one of those hotels down by University Hospital, where they give you a reasonable rate and then they shuttle you over. But I said to myself, this is not good. I can't leave them here. And my sister was in Crouse at that time, and I had the keys to her house. So I called up my wife, who's a very understanding person. And I said to her, do you care if I just stay overnight and then I can be here for the surgery for Gerald tomorrow? And she said, sure. So I went out and bought some underwear and stuff. And then I could be back there for the surgery the next day and be with Gerald and Margaret. And in between waiting, shuttle back and forth between Crouse and upstate and see my sister. So I don't know. There's all kinds of meaningful things, from the looking at the castle to being able to be part of people's lives when they really need it, and you feel like you can do something positive for them. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bob. I just had to make a note that in your stories, you mentioned some of the themes that we heard over and over again when we were here for the scanning event, which was boats, the water, and castles. And there aren't that many places we go that there's more than one castle. So our third storyteller is actually Judy Keeler, who is going to be talking a little bit about her teaching career. So if we could give her a big round of applause. Both for telling a story and for bringing us here tonight, because we really appreciate it.
Well, I'm not going to follow Bob Vrooman. Nope. Well, I've been asked to speak a little bit about the museum. If you haven't been upstairs and downstairs, this is a good place for you to go. We also have events every Thursday in July. This year is a little different. Next week we have Christine Tisa, and it's the river and its influence on my art. And this year, the art in the islands is the subject of our gallery talks. And we had Max Patterson last week with an evening of river rat melodies, which was most enjoyable. And then on August 8th, so that's when we skip a week. We have, and some people will show up on Thursday night even when we skip a week, but we have Elaine Tack, who is behind the scenes of documentary filmmaking on the river. And then we don't usually do August, but on August 29th, Tom Foligno, who did a wonderful, wonderful job with years of research on Bill Johnston, our famous river so-called pirate. He and Jeremy Smith and a couple of other actors who have yet to be named are going to come and perform an original one-act play about Bill Johnston written by Tom Foligno. So, yes.
I was corrected about that by Tom Foligno.
Oh,
They're not actually performing, they're doing a reading.
okay. So it's like a reader's theater. All right, okay. So that's what they're doing. So whatever they're doing, I'm sure it will be wonderful, and you should come. Okay. All right. So when we have in September and the first week of October until Columbus Day, we have River Ramblings, which started 3 years ago by Suzanne, and she had this idea that people should just come and tell their stories. And as you can hear tonight, there are wonderful stories, and people sit around by the window and just share. You hear a lot about the St. James Hotel when you come to But yeah, and then we have lunch, and then people just stand around and talk. So if you haven't been on a Thursday in September or October, you need to come. So, all right, so I'm going to, anything else I should say about the museum? We are membership driven and donations, and come and share your stuff. Yes.
Can we talk about the tea?
Thank you. Yay, May. Next Friday, we have our annual trip to Casablanca, and it's called a Victorian tea, but it's lemonade and tea and all kinds of wonderful refreshments coordinated by May on the porch, and you are free to wander around the wonderful old estate of Casablanca, do the boathouse and the whole business. One year we went, and the boat was servicing a wedding on Boat Castle, and the photography was taking too long, and the boat didn't come back. And people were in the hammocks, and they were on the porch, and they were relaxing around, and when the boat came, nobody wanted to leave. So, well, for 34 years, I was a teacher. I started as a speech therapist. They didn't have a speech therapist here, and they actually drafted me to come up. And I was going to come and stay for 3 years, earn enough money to go back to school, and become a clinical speech therapist and live in some city that had culture. Yeah, then I met a riverette, and I started teaching first grade, and there's a lot of culture here. So I think as a speech therapist, and then I did that for just 3 years, and then I joined the team of Martha and Melinda, and we became the Three Sisters, and I'm the wannabe. People to this day still think we're sisters. And we taught a various amount of subjects, mostly kindergarten, first grade, and Melinda spent 1 year in Spanish, and she didn't stay there. And the thing about teaching, it is a commitment. It is a responsibility, and you're dealing with other people's children. And you're instilling, there are all these things, and we've been out quite a while now, but they keep piling on more and more things that you have to teach. And I think the most important thing that you're teaching is a love of learning, a love of reading. We were at primary, so the reading and the arithmetic was the main thing, and a passion for learning. And you're creating memories. Well, we've created memories too. I asked Martha for a couple, and one of the ones she remembered was George. And the kids were all busily putting their crayons back in their box, and there is George. When you're working in the North Country, you're working in a small community like this, you're coming with kids from all kinds of backgrounds. And George was getting quite frustrated with his crayons. And I can't tell you all the way he said it, but he said, "Get in there, you." And Melinda had to give him a little correction. And then she caught George with chewing tobacco in his pocket. And so she called the mother, and the mother said, "Oh, dear, it's okay in the barn, but he's not supposed to bring it to school." He was in kindergarten. And then Melinda's story was, she put Michael. She put Michael in the hallway just to have a little time out to cool down a little bit, and suddenly the fire alarm came off. Michael, what did you do? For memories, one of the things that I did in teaching social studies is we did 3 first grades, and we took turns teaching the science, social studies, and health. And we taught United States history. Our subject was Washington. So we had a pretend trip to Washington, D.C. And the Big M, who was always really good, gave us meat trays, and the cafeteria it was back in the days, this goes way back, it was back in the days when you actually got food on an airplane. So we all had trays, we all packed our suitcases with what you'd need for overnight. They were paper suitcases, and you cut things out of magazines, and the kids really got into it. And Amy went home and said, "Mom, I don't think I can stay overnight." I mean, she really thought we were going to Washington. So this same Amy's, we lined all the chairs up, and we had a movie that shows an airplane taking off, and we had pictures of Washington, D.C., and we did tours and stuff. And as we were in the airplane and we were flying, Mrs. Kuhn came in with my piles of papers that she had dittoed, and Amy looked at her and said, "Mrs. Kuhn, how did you get way up here?" And then the other thing, we taught George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and the kids were all very interested in the fact that Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated, and they got into, so they said, well, how did George Washington die? Well, I had to go home and look it up. And I came back and said, well, he got sick, he had pneumonia, and in those days, they leeched him. They actually put leeches on them, and they thought they could draw out the bad blood and make them better. And it was too much, and he died. And so Amy, again, went home and said, Mommy, guess what happened to George Washington? He got ammonia, and they bleached him, and he died. And then there's Peter. Sometimes the insightfulness of these children is absolutely amazing. We were doing geometry, and we had talked about prisms, triangles, and the shapes and so forth. And Peter stands in lunch line, and he said, Mrs. Keeler, I went home and thought about it. And if a rectangle is a rectangular prism, and a triangle is a triangular prism, why isn't a cylinder a cylindrical prism? It took me a while. I said, Peter, I think prisms have to have angles. Right? I hope I was right. And then Peter, we had a social studies chart, and it had all these concepts that they were supposed to learn in social studies. And we were reading a story in reading about dinosaurs alive and well in body, soul, and spirit. So we were explaining, and the kid said, so what is soul? And I'm trying to explain. And Peter looks at me and he said, Mrs. Keeler, I've got it. Your soul is the culture of your mind. Think about that. Well, he went home and he told his mother, he said, Mommy, I must have said something good because Mrs. Keeler told everybody. So there, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you so much, Judy. So our next storyteller, I think, while the work is not similar, she also came to the area with plans of not staying for very long, I just learned. Jean Elk moved here in 1947 to work at the E.J. Noble Hospital, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her time working as a nurse.
Hi, Bob. I was born in Canada, in Brockville, Ontario, and so when I was 7, my parents moved to Syracuse. So I graduated from high school in Syracuse and then went back to Canada to train in the same hospital I was born in. And graduated in 1945 and wrote state boards in the province of Ontario. Then I came back to Syracuse and worked at St. Joe's and Memorial Hospital for a couple of years. So then I met a friend of mine who was having lunch with Marion Green, who at the time was superintendent of this little hospital in Alex Bay. She said, well, why don't you come and work up here for the summer? And I said, sounds good, different, something new. So I came to work in April of 1947 at a hospital that was a house. Had 3 bedrooms upstairs and 2 bedrooms downstairs, and a little room, a little entry room, which is where the nurse's station was, where the patients gathered and when they came in to be seen. So, and it was a great, great place to work, and I learned a lot because I was the only RN on the 3 to 11 shift, and I had one old lady who had no training. And so the two of us worked together, and there were 7 doctors in the area that we took care of too. Yeah, took care of, I mean. So, let me see. Oh, then, but we worked 12 hours, 7 in the morning till 7 at night. So then they hired 2 new graduates who had worked 8 hours, and they wouldn't work 12 hours. So we got all of us got that worked 12 hours got to work 8, and that was a big chore. So anyhow, we did everything. We did surgery. Surgeons used to come from Watertown and do gallbladders, tonsils, appendix, anything that needed to be done, they did. So, and never can I remember ever having an infection there. But we certainly saw the emergency room patients, took care of heart attacks. We took care of anything that came in the door. I pretty much, because I just had this one untrained old lady to help. So, but one time we had a maternity patient upstairs, and she had already had 6 children. Doctor said, do not leave her alone, because when she gets ready to pop, she's going to go. So, and I was working 3 to 11, and it got time for me to give my medicines at 6. So I sent this old lady up to sit with the patient. And in one of the downstairs bedrooms, I had a heart patient and a crib with a 20-month-old baby in it. So in the same room. The state would not allow that today. So anyhow, after I finished giving the medicines, the baby was crying. So I warmed a bottle, and I sat and was feeding the baby when Tressie, the nurse's aide, called downstairs and said, Jean, you need to come up here. So I took the baby, gave it to the heart patient, along with the bottle, and went upstairs, and we delivered the baby. Well, doctor did. And so when I came down, the patient was sound asleep, the baby sound asleep in his arms. Yeah, the state had closed the place today. They used to say all our medicines came from Governor, because it was part of E.J. Noble. And when they used to send ice cream, pint ice cream containers with Nebutol filled at the top. That's the way they sent our medicine. Today, it's locked up in a safe. Then it was not. Let me see. Yeah, all those 7 doctors I worked with are now dead. Yep. Our operating room was in what was a laundry room in this house, and the operating table had to be moved out from the wall. The scrub nurse would get all ready, would go behind the table, we'd push the table back, the surgeon would come in, do his surgery, and there was that nurse there until the surgery was done. At one end of the thing was the sterilizer, and that was part of the operating room. Yeah. let me see. Yeah, Dr. Greger was a surgeon who'd come from Watertown. And as I said, he did gallbladders, hernias, tonsils, and there was a stairway that went up, of course, to the second floor. And you walked up 2 steps and then the banister turned. So they had to get carpenters to come in and cut the railing off so we could lift the railing off and the stretcher could get up the stairs. Can't ever remember having an infection in that hospital. And today, with all the modern devices they have infections all the time. You're safer staying home, I guess. One time, we had an ambulance, which was an old Ford station wagon with wooden sides, and got a call from Wellesley Island. And this farmer said, "My wife has just delivered her baby, and I don't know what to do." And I said, "Well, you have to cut the cord, and you have to tie it off." He said, "I don't have anything to tie it off with." I said, "Take your shoelace out and tie it off with the shoelace." And that's what he did, and that's how it came in. So that's pretty much my story about.
I have a question. When you had too many babies in the hospital, how did you?
We only had 3 bassinets and 2 bassinets. If we have a 3rd baby, we take a dresser drawer out, put a blanket in the bottom, and that's where the baby sat.
Can I ask a question? Where was this hospital? Was it the one that they talk about on the corner here? There used to be a hospital?
It was on Market Street, and the ship.
Where the ship hotel is now.
Yeah, they tore the house down and built the ship motel. Yeah, but it was a great place to work and a great place to learn. Yeah, and 6 years after I finished training and came to New York State decided they didn't have reciprocity with Ontario, and I had to write state boards 6 years after I finished, but it worked out. Yep, and that's my story.
Thank you so much, Jean, for taking us truly back in time. So some of the stories that people bring in for North Country at Work, they don't always talk about themselves. Sometimes they also talk about what their parents did. And so that's sort of where our next storyteller is coming from. He's going to talk a little bit about him, but a lot about his father, who was a trapper and also cut. I'm going to need you to explain this, actually, Dave. And we don't usually have props, but I think tonight we do have a prop, and it's a pretty good one. So if everyone can give a big hand for our next storyteller, Dave Johnson.
Well, that old thing's been around for quite a while, sitting in my garage. Wondering why. Actually, at one time it was at Halloween. I think we had them out in front of the sub shop. But the bottom line is that I'm going to take a page out of Bob's thing, how he opened up. And we learned our work ethic from our folks. I remember learning to drive a tractor when I was 11. You know, those days obviously are gone. But she is correct. My father was Roy Johnson. And he had a third of his living. He was a preacher, and he was a professional trapper, and he caught what is what we affectionately called chair flag, okay? And so how we got into trapping, I'll tell that story, and then I want to concentrate on what we have here tonight. How we got into trapping is that in 1942, his father, they were down in Orange County, and his father was working on a poultry farm, okay? And the bottom line is that he was making 25 bucks a week, his father was. So he caught this mink, and he cleaned it up the best he could, and he sold it to Sears and Roebuck for $43. So that kind of explains the inspiration, okay, that would further his trapping career all the way through seminary and then on to be a preacher, which he did in the area up in the First Congregational Church of Morristown. He did that from 64 to 75. And then at Pleasant Meadows Ministries, which is now closed, and which was a ministry for our soldiers in Evans Mills. He did that later on in his life. But let's concentrate on what we have here, okay, in front of us, and I will try to explain real briefly. The green leaf of the cattail, we're not talking, the cattail itself is the brown part that you see in the local swamps, okay? You can see it right here on the river if we probably looked out the window, okay? What we see along the river is a hard species. This here was cut behind what is now the Big M. I did this a number of years ago just to have for props, and but this is the soft variety. The hard variety is a lot narrower and it's a lot more brittle, okay? The hard variety, though, was used to a certain degree, okay? What they did in the fall of the year in the hard variety was reach down towards the butt of the flag where it went down in the water, and many leaves would come together, okay, and there's like a glue-like substance, okay, if you will, that has to dry out, but they would cut about 18 inches long, okay, and they would cut that and dry that out. And we all remember, I'm sure, even to this day, they do use some in the old staves, the pickle barrels, okay, the wine barrels especially, okay. The insulation that was used was the butt of the hard species that you see along the river, okay. This one here, is the soft variety. It's a wider leaf, okay, as you can see. This is only a couple of bundles. We used to go out in the swamp, and the old knife that I still have, okay, is pretty rough shape. So I didn't bring any of that, but I could have brought a ton of props, but. The handle will be about this long, the blade about approximately this long. And you go out in your hip boots in the swamp, okay, and the cattail we would not use, so that would be pushed down. You have to reach around, okay, the flag and bring it up. It has to be at least 3.5 feet tall, which is right up to my belly button. So, and you would have to adjust for that if you're in the water up to your knees. Okay, so of course, the taller the product, the better it was. And we would have a rack, just a little bit 1x3s. Okay, we'd make a little rack, and we carry that around the swamp, and you would cut the green stuff and go down and cut it, and then put it in and turn around and put it in the rack. Then tie it up with bands. We would bring that in at the end of the day, okay? Bring it up to the flag fields, if you will, which were in different areas. So the one that was known for is up to the Pierce Farm, which is over by Redwood, right on Route 37. That was our best one, okay? Because that is sand bottom, all right? So we lay it out in a fan it out for about 3 days, depending on, everything's on the weather, okay? And then at the end of 3 days, you turn it inside out, take 4 of them with big long poles we had, put 2 on each side and tie them up like you see here, okay? Approximately 10 days, depending on the weather, okay? And a lot of care, all right? Then we would take them and put them up into the barn. And Pa's sniffer was so keen, I remember one day him walking in to the barn and, what the devil are you smelling? I had no idea. And all of a sudden he started taking the pile apart. And sure enough, one of them had some moisture in there, and if that mold had spread, it could, it could cause a barn fire, if you will, just like spontaneous combustion, okay, because of the moisture. He was more worried about the integrity of the product, okay, the mold, all right. So one thing I would like to point out, that at the end of every year, we would ship this out. Mr. Huron is now passed, okay? And I remember him taking this down to Hitchcock Company, okay, and which was down in Connecticut. And their sense of, this art died off in the mid '80s, and Hitchcock is now obviously gone. But this is one of the chairs that all our siblings have. That this would have been Pa's cutting for sure. But I want everyone to look at the bottom. So if you ever see these in any church or anywhere, there's a lot of imitations. Hong Kong grass was imported, and that replaced this particular type of design, if you will. Okay, there's caning, okay, which my sister still does, and I'm flying. But I want to show you how to tell the difference. Okay. On the very bottom of this chair, you will see what you see right there. You see the fibers, okay, where that was cut, all right? They would take 3 of these leaves, put it through a solution. I was never ever at the plant, but they put it through a solution, and these seats would be in for hundreds of years. People would say, of course, I was just a young fellow when we were doing this. And I work on a farm, and my father says, you try to, when there's dew on that, he says, you twist them together, okay, and you pull them apart. Well, I almost had blood in my hands, you know what I mean, trying to get that apart. You cannot. I remember even tying it to two bumper to bumper, 2 vehicles, to see how much, I said, man, I'm going to break this thing, but just being a smart mouth to my father, but these are extremely durable. One last point, if I have time, is that Native Americans knew the value in the middle of the harsh winter. In other words, in the morning when I would go out, or we were in the swamp and we cut this, the next day when we came out, the butt end, is out of the swamp about this high. So you could do this to this day. If you went out back, and if you have a pug hole that has this there, you cut it. The next morning, go out, and you will see a shoot about this high, okay? You grab hold of that shoot, pull on it, okay? It'll break off inside, and the end about this big will be nice and white. Take your little salt shaker, put that on there. You eat that, and it tastes like the best cucumber you've ever had, okay? And that had nutritional value to the Native Americans in the winter, because they could break those things apart if there was a real harsh, if they're in a survival mode, you ate what was available, and that was available and did have some nutrition. So, but thank you very much, and that's...
Dave, can I ask, how old were you when you started going out with your dad?
Oh, I was in the flag fields when I was young, because on here, sometimes the product would not be tall enough, so we would have to cut in the butt. And so that means you would have to, here's a butt end right here. So we'd have to put our thumbs through it and split it so it would dry properly. Okay, so we call that splitting butts. So you get over there and split butts, and if I was 5 years old, I was old enough. So the bottom line is, from wherever I can remember, and as far as that's concerned, and forgive me if I put a lot, but that is just a gone art, Very, very interesting stuff.
Well, thank you for sharing again, Dave. I'll make one more plug for the archive. Actually, Dave shared a bunch of photos with us, and they're really, really cool. And those are online. And I think there's one in the exhibit as well. So our last planned storyteller for the night, and I should say that after sort of our planned storytellers, we have room for pop-up storytellers for anyone who wants to tell a story who didn't necessarily know beforehand. So that'll be after our final storyteller, Barbara Brown, who I actually met a year and a half ago in Morristown. And she is also going to talk a little bit about her own work, but also a bit about her father's work. And I think she's going to bring us back to, she's also going to tell a story about the river.
What was the story I was going to tell about the river?
Are you not talking about guiding?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So, interesting. I went to Sweden. Most people don't go to northern Sweden in February, but I went to Sweden this year, northern Sweden, and the Sami people, which are the reindeer herders, actually use that also because their shoes look like elf shoes, and they use that to stuff the top of the elf shoe, their boots, to keep them warm because the air gets trapped in the reeds, and it's pretty cool. I like that. Yeah, it was fun. So I come from a long line of, as the wind and the willows would say, people like to mess around in boats, and I kind of feel like when I start to talk about it, I sound like Marissa Tomei and my cousin Vinny. You know, my brother worked on the boat line, my grandfather worked on the boat line, my great-grandfather worked on boats, and even my great-grandmother worked on boats. So it's kind of my destiny, I guess. So when I was ready to have my first job, I went to the boat line, and thankfully I was hired. Jack Snow, who was the manager at the time, happened to be a former student of my father's, and he said, well, if she's your daughter, then we'll probably hire her. So it was one more case, as a former career counselor, one more case that networking is really, really important. So I started working at the boat line when I was 18. But my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother probably set the tone here. She was as my father said, a wee Scottish, red-haired Scottish woman who at 4'11", carried a shotgun with her all the time, and she was not afraid to use it. My great-grandfather worked on the steamers. Both my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather worked on the steamers that went up and down the Great Lakes. And we don't really know how far away that my grandfather went, but certainly out to the mouth of the St. Lawrence. But there would be a number of times when my grandfather was gone, and my grandmother, who was a cook on the steamers, didn't always go. And so when she was here alone, my father went to stay with her. And they lived, what is now the river edge, they lived in what was called the flats, and it was above boathouses. And here she is with this, little kid. My father was really little too, and she had this shotgun. And so one night when he was staying with her, there was a ruckus outside, and she went to see what it was, and she was a pretty nice woman, I guess. And she went to see what it was, and there were some drunk people who were interested in seeing her, and she raised her shotgun and she said, you make one more step closer to this window and I'm going to count to 3 and you better be off that roof. And he said he never saw drunk people move so fast. So apparently her reputation preceded her. But my great-grandfather, whose name was Todd, and there are some pictures around here I've seen of Todd. He must have worked pretty well and made a good living on the steamers because he made enough to buy his own tour boat. And I think there's a couple of pictures of that around here too. And so in the summer he would give tours. I still have his captain's chair and the wicker, kind of like the wicker chairs that are over here that were in the tour boats at that time. And in addition to that, well, he wasn't giving tours in the winter. So what he would do in the winter was pick up any kind of job he could pick up. And my father said that he was a butcher and a baker, and he never said anything about a candlestick maker, but he did everything. And my father could usually remember about his grandfather that his hands were always in bandages, because when he was a butcher, he had a lot of accidents, apparently. And then, so now we're down to my grandfather, whom I never knew. And he started out working on the boats at the ferry in Morristown, the Morristown-Brockville ferry. And that's where he met my grandmother, who was Canadian, had walked across the ice when she was 6 with her family. And that's how he became an American citizen at that point. And so anyway, they got married, and they came to the bay, and he bought a boat. That's what you do in my family. He bought a boat, and he set up a tour also. And his boat was called the Brownie, which was my father's nickname, was my nickname, and there's a picture of that here as well. And he ran his own tour boat for a number of years. He died quite young, and while he was running his tour boat, my grandmother ran a rooming house. She didn't call it a boarding house because my grandmother loved to eat, but she didn't like to cook. And so she had a rooming house, and it's in the house that I still own on Walton Street. So it's kind of a big, I think it's about 4,000 square feet, so she had quite a operation going there, and she had postcards made of the house to advertise, and on the bottom of the postcards, and I think that also is here, it said, Mrs. Captain George W. Brown. She was very proud of being captain's wife. So that was my grandfather and my grandmother. And actually, the other thing my grandfather did was a chauffeur at the Thousand Island Yacht Club, which is no longer in existence. It used to be on Welcome Island, which is not too far upriver from here. And it's very hot tonight, so I wore a jacket. I not have a jacket on now, but on that jacket, it's very nautical, are the buttons that my grandfather had on his uniform when he was the chauffeur from Welcome Island. So that brings me to my brother. My brother was 10 years older than I, and he set the stage for working on the boat line. He worked first on the Pilgrim, which I noticed a number of pictures here of the Pilgrim line, and then he worked, I think he started there a little bit underage. We didn't talk about that at the time. And then he went from the Pilgrim, he went across the town dock over to the Paul boat line, and he worked at the Paul boat line for a number of years with the Snyders. And then from there, he moved to Uncle Sam or combined boat lines. And that's when my mother took me for a tour to listen to my brother do the announcing. And as I said, he was 10 years older than I, and it was probably when he was about 16, maybe 15, when she took me on the tour. She was very proud of him. And my biggest memory at that point, and the thing that impressed me the most as a little kid, was my brother, who very kindly helped the little old ladies on the boat and helped the little old ladies off the boat. Apparently that's what impressed me the most, and it was probably a foreshadowing that I would spend 20 years of my life later on as a counselor. But my brother was really my hero for my whole life. And so that brings me to my first job, which, as I said, was at Uncle Sam Boat Tours. And I remember probably the funniest and probably the most dangerous time that I had on the boat line was when Rick Tagg, who is now an architect, and I were over on the Canadian Channel. And we had one of the little tour boats. They don't have them anymore, but we had one of the little tour boats, and they had windows that went up to the inside of the boat. And in order for you to latch them, if you were going to bring them down, you had to go out on the gunnels of the boat. Well, it started out a beautiful trip, and we did the first half of the trip, went up almost to the bridge and came back down. We went over onto the Canadian side, and we're going up to the Canadian Channel, and all of a sudden it was a huge, huge, huge storm. And these people were getting soaked. So I, as the announcer, on a little boat where the only other person there was the captain, I had to go out on the gunnels of the boat and actually pull those windows down and latch them. Well, the funniest part of and that was not really a big thing for us all. We did that on a number of occasions. But the funniest thing about it was that all these, it was a senior citizens trip, and they all were terrified that I was going to fall off the boat. So every next window that I went to, actually, I had another set of hands that would grab onto my ankles to make sure that I wasn't going to fall off into the river, because I didn't tell them this, but I don't really swim very well. And all the life jackets were up underneath the windows, so you couldn't get to the life jackets if the windows were open. So that probably was my favorite story of the boat tour. But I have to say that that Jack Snow, who was a wonderful manager, made it very, very easy for me to work toward my own personal dream, which was to skate in an ice show. And so I would work every day at the boat line, and I'd have Wednesdays off. So every day I'd work, I'd get off at 5, and they made sure that I was off at 5. And I'd drive to Canton, and I'd skate at Appleton for 2 hours, and then I'd drive back and work the next day and do the same thing the next night, except on Tuesdays, in which case then I would skate at Appleton for 2 hours and then drive by myself to Lake Placid, stay with friends, skate all day in Lake Placid, then come back and skate that night in Appleton, and then come back and do the whole thing over again. So the boat line was really, really, it was wonderful that they accommodated me in that way, because it was a big dream, and I'm happy to say I got there. So thank you. This was a great thing.
Thank you, Barbara. I didn't do you justice in the introduction. You told us a lot more than about just your father. So that's our last planned storyteller of the night. I believe we had someone who was volunteering to be a pop-up. Are you still? Okay, so, and then after this one, if anyone else is interested, that's your chance. So I think our pop-up storyteller is Dawn Metzger. And I actually didn't even realize it until we got here, and I met him again. But actually, we did meet like almost 3 years ago, right when the project started in Dexter. So I'm happy to be able to welcome Dawn to the stage.
Thanks, Amy. As Amy said, I'm Don Metzger, and I live near Cape Vincent, just up the river. And I want to talk to you about my work. I'm still working. I'm 74, and I'm still gainfully employed as a pilot on the Seaway. And I have been blessed with always loving to go to work my whole life, whether I was a cadet or a third mate or a second mate or a chief mate or a captain or a pilot. I've always enjoyed going to work. But I'm not going to talk to you about icebergs or storms or fog or collisions or people falling over the side or pirates. I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff. I want to talk about one day in my, what have I been working now, 56 years now, I guess. I want to talk about one day when I didn't want to go to work. It was, first I have to say, I've never known depression. I've been very blessed that way. I have a very steady personality. Sure, I've been grieving and sad when I lose a relative or a friend or a pet, but I've never really been in a real funk. Well, November 11th, 2001 came along. And as a cadet in New York City, I watched no, I wasn't a cadet, I was third mate then. I watched the World Trade Centers go up. I watched them dig the hole in the ground, and then 70 feet down into Manhattan, and then go up. And then I went to the World Trade Center many times on meetings and classes and so on and so on. And now on 2011, September 11, I see the World Trade Centers go down. And I have classmates and colleagues who work there. And I was very deeply affected, and the thing that really bothered me a lot was that the Department of Transportation shut down our airways, and aviation had played a big role in my life and in my family's life. My father was a pilot in the war, my two uncles were pilots, my father-in-law was a test pilot for the B-17 bomber. Charles Lindbergh, who crossed the Atlantic, first person to cross the Atlantic, used to land on the grass strip at my mother-in-law's ranch in Texas, and she would refabric the planes and all. Aviation has played a big role in my life, and now the skies are shut down, and I don't see or hear a plane or any kind of an aircraft anywhere. It had a big effect on me, but even more a serious effect was the fact that the marine transportation system was shut down. All the ships throughout the United States, ferry boats, tugboats, everything came to a halt. And this is my life, this is my business. So the air is shut down, the sea and water is shut down, and my classmates, I can't get a hold of them, my colleagues and all. Were they in the Trade Center or not? I don't know. So I couldn't go to work. The seaway was shut down. 3 days later, the seaway opens up. And I was called by the dispatcher to go service a Polish ship down at Snellock and Messina and bring the Polish ship up through to Cape Vincent to go on its voyage. All my life, I've had a smile on my face when I've gone to work, whether it was 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, whether it was Christmas Day or July 4 or my birthday or whatever. I've always enjoyed going to work. That day, I hated to go to work. And I said to my wife, honey, I said, I just don't want to go to work today. And she said, I know. She put her arms around me. She said, like she always does, have a safe voyage. Because if you have a safe voyage, that's the best thing that can happen. It doesn't make any difference whether it's cold or hot, or whether it was a lousy ship, a fast ship, a slow ship, a rust bucket. If it's a safe trip, it's a good trip. So I got in the car and I drove the 2.5 miles down to Snellock in a real funk. Normally I'd listen to North Country Public Radio, or I turned my favorite music on or something. I didn't want anything on. I did for about 5 minutes turn on North Country just to get an update on the situation from the terrorism attack. I get down to Snellock. I'm slumped over, and the ship is coming into the lock, and it raises up, and then you have to board the ship, and then you have to climb about 6 decks to get up to the bridge, to the nerve center of the ship. I got out of the car, I see the ship coming in the lock. Boy, I just hate going to work today. And I walk up to the bridge. I'm supposed to have a master pilot exchange and get the ship going and move on. There's other ships all waiting. We've been shut down for 3 days, nothing has moved. And now we're moving, so there's a big backlog, and there's pressure to get moving. And got up to the bridge, and the Polish captain says to me, good afternoon, Mr. Pilot. He says, may I have a word with you? Well, when he said that, I thought, holy cow, Has he got a stowaway on the ship, or is there something that we can't talk about publicly or something? So he went back into the chart room, and he says to me, Mr. Pilot, he says, I'm very sad, I'm very sorry for what has happened to you and your country. And he said, I hope you've not lost any of your friends or colleagues in the attacks. But he says, I want you to know this. He says, this attack was not just on your country. It was an attack on all of us, on all of the free world. He says, you know, our New York office is only 2 blocks from the World Trade Center. I said, yes, Cap, I know it's 17 Battery Place. It's a very famous place. He says, that's right. He says, we did not lose anybody. He said, but I don't know about you. I said, well, Cap, I'm still trying to assess the situation, but thank you for your concern. He says, I've been sailing my whole life since I was a cadet in Poland to the United States. He says, I love your country as much as I love my native country, Poland. What happened to you happened to all of us, and we will come out of this the better. And he shook my hand, and I said, thank you, Cap, for your concern. And I walked out into the wheelhouse, into the nerve center from the chart room. My back was straight, my shoulder was back, I had a smile on my face, and I said, gentlemen, we've got a ship to move, we've got ports to visit, let's go. And this voyage went perfectly, and to this day, I have never sailed with that captain again. I've never seen him again, nor have I sailed with him again. But I'm so thankful to him for the way he responded. He brought me out of my slump, and he talked to me not only as a professional mariner to a professional mariner, but he talked to me as another human being, as a crew member on planet Earth. He's a crew member, I'm a crew member, and we're both sailing through this together. And I'm, to this day, 18 years later, haven't seen him since. I still remember him, and I'm still grateful to him, and I'm hoping that maybe someday I can do the same thing for another fellow seafarer. Thank you.
Thank you, Don, so much for sharing that. Do we have any other pop-up storytellers? Ah, yes? Well, if you'd come up and just say your name and then tell us your story.
My name's Jerry Tidd. I was brought up in Alexandria Bay, born in Syracuse, and I think my mother might have done your hair, Mrs. Elk. Betty Tidd, down on Bethune Street. Yeah? All right, so we have something in common. But I'd like to talk a little bit tonight, shortly, mainly about my dad. He graduated from high school here in 1927, a year ahead of when he was supposed to. He went to Rochester, put himself through RBI in 1 year, and went to Manhattan and worked down there for 2 years as an accountant. He just didn't like the city life, so he came back up north, and he ended up in Syracuse. But a little story about my last year in school and his last year in school. Ed Calley, most of you, if you're from the Bay, you knew Ed Calley, and he had just gotten out of the service, I believe, when he came to the high school in Alexandria Bay. And he made me read a frickin' book. And I was asking around with my colleagues, I said, what's this? Hey, look, if you haven't read it yet, All Quiet on the Western Front. There's a good, fast read for a high school kid. So I pick up the book, I leaf through it, it's got big print, That was one requisite. I take the book up, and I go to check it out. And at that time, they had the cards in the back, if you remember. And the last person to check that book out in 1927 was my dad. And I could not believe that something like that would happen, but it did. So he ended up getting married in Syracuse. He worked at Syracuse Supply for a couple of years. He bought some income property on Genesee Street, sold it for probably $4,000 or $5,000. Today it's all doctor's offices and everything else. But he came back up here, and he bought a house at 5 Bethune Street. And when, let's see, I was brought up in that house until 1955. And then my dad decided he was working for Johnny Rappole at the lumber company where River Edge is right now. And Johnny would lay him off in the winter. My dad he'd go crazy because he didn't have anything to do. So he decided he wanted to get into a motel. So we had spent a couple of winters, 6 weeks, 7 weeks at a time in Florida, around Lake Minnehaha, or Clearwater, not Clearwater, Claremont area. And he got some ideas in his head as to what he wanted to do. So he came up to, we moved from Syracuse on my second birthday, I don't remember it, moved from Syracuse on my second birthday, moved into 5 Bethune Street, and in 1955, he decided that's when he wanted to start the motel. So he and another fellow in town here, Miller Hartman, who was an accomplished carpenter, they spent winters working on the motel. In the summertime, my dad would rent out the sections that they had done. And he finished with that in 1963 or maybe 1964. But during that time, he was, I won't say he was an avid duck hunter, but he did hunt ducks, took me with him, and for my 14th Christmas, he gave me a Savage bolt-action 16-gauge shotgun with a poly choke on the end. And we're hunting up in the White Swamp. And we're in a canoe. The canoe is pretty stable because we got it lashed down with 2x2s we drove into the ground. And a lot of teal in the air that day. And a teal goes by, poof, I pop it. Teal goes by, poof, my father misses it. Another one comes by, poof, I drop it. Poof, he misses it. He says, give me that goddamn gun. So I gave him the gun. He gave me his, a 12-gauge Remington automatic, and a flock of birds goes by. He missed him. Flock came my way. Pew, I dropped 3 out of the flock. He says, give me that gun. So that was a lot of fun. We actually went home for lunch that day. There were so many birds up there, and we were such poor shots that we went home for lunch, went down to Britain's hardware store, and picked up new ammunition, and went back up there, but we had dish towels in our shoulders because his was an automatic, so it had a little bit of forgiveness for the recoil, but mine did not. And I don't think we shot many more birds, but it was a lot of fun. In the early part of the 60s, my dad became involved in a boat line before the Pilgrim boat line. Who was talking about the Pilgrim boat line? Yeah, it was the War boat line before that. And it was owned by 20 business people in Alexandria Bay. And they asked my dad if he would run it for him. And they changed the name to Pilgrim. and he ran it for him for probably 4 years. And then it became combined with the Uncle Sambo tours. My dad and Graham Thompson had worked out a deal, and they were able to sell Pilgrim, and these people could get rid of their shares of stock and maybe even make a little tiny bit of money, and they were all so happy to get rid of it, they were elated. So I remember that very well. I also remember do you know, anybody know where the Hartman Block was downtown? Where Edic's drugstore used to be? Yep. He owned that block. He bought it with some equity from one of the houses in Syracuse. And I remember two things that I hated about that house. Well, I hated the tenants, but it had a flat tar roof. And every summer, that roof had to be scraped, and all of that loose tar had to be taken off. And then you had to brush regular tar, new tar over the top of that. I really hated that job. But one I didn't hate quite so much was he paid me 25 cents to sweep. It was a 3-story building, and there was, 2 sets of stairs and a hallway. And he would pay me 25 cents a week to sweep the stairs. So, and the rest is history.